Jay Callahan again. And this is another one of our video mini lectures for the course Crisis Intervention. And today we're going to talk about a case of acute dissociation of consciousness, meaning me. Okay, this is my story of a dissociative episode I had, the only one in my life, never before, never after, when a client pulled a gun on us. So I mentioned it previously, but I want to quickly jump in and say it turned out okay. Nobody got hurt. Nobody was injured. The bottom line, it was okay. But as you'll see, it was a pretty scary situation for a little bit of time. If you recall from my introductory video, the emergency program, the psychiatric emergency services that I was in a leadership role at Michigan included not only walk-in service at the ER, but we had outreach workers, 2 at a time. And this was the job that I had originally done before I ever worked in the ER. We had outreach workers who were mostly social workers who would go out into the community when there was an emergency that needed attention in the community. And this was one of those cases. So before I get into the case itself, I just want to briefly review a little bit about what we talked about dissociation before in a previous video. And if you recall, one of the ways to think about dissociation that I mentioned before is 4 categories from very mild to more serious. The most mild kind of dissociation is dissociation of emotion. And again, most of these are following trauma, and this would be the kind of thing that happens to people after even not so terrible traumatic death, or certainly many other traumatic events. If asked, how do you feel now that XYZ has happened, people often feel numb. They feel nothing. They say, well, how do I feel? I don't feel anything. And this is very common in the aftermath of trauma. Second is dissociation of consciousness, which is what happened to me and what I'll be talking about in a minute. But if you recall from our review, we talked about people feeling zoned out or spaced out, depersonalization when they feel detached and separate from themselves, derealization when the world and the surroundings don't seem real, general feelings of unreality, things like that. Third is dissociation of memory, amnesia, and I think I already told you about the case of the teenage girl whose father died in the house fire and the amnesia that she had at that time. And then finally, the 4th category is dissociation of identity, the most severe type, usually only from chronic trauma, chronic physical and sexual abuse, when people develop alternate personalities, or in fugue states, when people flee the trauma, go to another location, have amnesia for what happened, and take up a new identity. So what we're talking about now in the case of me, what happened to me, is dissociation of consciousness. Okay, so this was an outreach case, and it started out with a call from the family of a 24-year-old guy who had a previous diagnosis of bipolar disorder, which was clearly correct, and that when the call came in on this particular day, he had been manic and he had been violent and beat up his father. Now when the call came in and we checked our records, it turns out this was the same guy who had done the same thing a couple weeks before. And on that occasion, the family, and the family really means the parents, the dad and the mom, on that occasion had called the police. The sheriff's department covered the area in which they lived. It was a rural house out in the country outside of Ann Arbor. And on that occasion, they brought him to our ER, which is, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. The way we worked with many situations, and especially with the police, would be if the police wanted to bring someone to the ER, that was fine, or if they wanted us to go to them, that was fine. And I would add here that I think we had a really good working relationship with the police, for a variety of reasons, one of which that I cultivated that and I wanted to make that work. And one of the operational ways to make that happen would be whenever we had a request for an outreach, we always did a certain amount of screening to see that, for example, it was an emergency. That is, the situation needed someone, a mental health person's attention right then. But the one and only exception would be if the police called, then we would dispatch the outreach team. Outreach team being the 2 workers who went. We would dispatch the outreach team without question, without really checking to see if it was an emergency, for example, or any of the other screening things that we would do. So anyway, on that other occasion, a couple of weeks before, the police brought this client to the ER. He had beaten up his father. He was clearly manic. He was clearly dangerous, and he was involuntarily hospitalized. I also had recalled in the present situation from this situation 2 weeks ago that not only had he been violent toward his father, but he tried to beat up. He got violent and tried to beat up one of our staff members in the ER as well. So he was clearly very volatile and difficult. So in the present situation, then my outreach partner Jamie and I met, and then we drove together and met the police and at the house, this rural house. And I noted that when we went to the house and met the police officer, one police officer in this case, that he was one of the 2 that had brought this guy to the ER 2 weeks before. So I knew that he knew the situation. We went in, we met with the family, we met with the client. He clearly was still manic and still violent. The dad had all kinds of bumps and bruises on his face, which was not that we didn't believe him. The story was totally believable from the parents, but there was, evidence, if you will. But I would say there was one surprising element, and that is we were sitting in the living room, the parents, the client. There was another guy, another young 20-ish guy who was a neighbor who the parents had called over for assistance to help them, basically protect themselves from their own son. And then there was Jamie and I and the sheriff's deputy sitting kind of in a circle in the living room. And what was striking was throughout the interview, in which he was verbally belligerent and arrogant and demanding, but he stayed seated in his chair the whole time, which was kind of surprising to me, because when people are manic, those of you in this class who have seen people are manic, they are high energy, they're agitated, they normally can't even sit still. And although, again, he was argumentative and angry, he stayed in his chair the whole time, which was surprising, and I think which maybe in part led to me making this major mistake that we'll talk about in a minute. Now, I have to say I made several mistakes, and this will be the time on another occasion to talk about my mistakes. But I had worked a regular day in the ER. I had to substitute for an outreach worker that night. It was 1 a.m. I was really tired. I just wanted to get this over with and get back home so I could go back to bed. And I made a number of major mistakes, which was also fodder for much communication later, much discussion later. Anyway, the client remained seated, and so that was surprising, and it made me think he wasn't as agitated and difficult and dangerous as he actually was. So me in particular, I told him that he was going to have to go to the hospital, and that he was going to have to go whether he wanted to or not, and he cussed me out. He was very angry and upset. But again, he stayed seated the whole time. Now, maybe that was because the police officer was right there. Although when he was in the ER, we had 2 security guards there, and that didn't keep him in his chair that time. So anyway, then when the interview was pretty much over, we were doing the paperwork for the involuntary hospitalization. He said to me, well, all right, well, can I go? And he kind of motioned with his head down toward the other end of the room, and there was a hallway, and you could see a hallway with bedrooms and a bathroom off. It was a 1-story kind of rural farmhouse. And he motioned down the hallway and said, well, okay, can I go get a few things? And I took that to mean clothes, if he was going to go to the hospital. And maybe he did mean that, I don't know, but that wasn't what he went to get. And so I said yes, and I didn't ask the deputy, could you please go with him? Okay, and that was the biggest mistake here. And it was a mistake on a number of levels. This was summer. It was a 1-story farmhouse. He could have gone down the hall into his bedroom, opened the window, and jumped out and ran away. It was a total oversight on my part to not have the sheriff's deputy accompany him to his bedroom. But, more importantly than that, I let him go to his room, and he came back a minute later and walked into the living room with a shotgun, which he held out pointed at the sheriff's deputy. And to his credit, the deputy was, boom, up out of his chair with his handgun out, pointing it at the client. And they had a kind of face-off going, the client with the shotgun, which later we were able to determine was loaded. And the sheriff's deputy jumped up with his handgun out, facing him, and the deputy was yelling, "Drop it, drop it, drop it." Okay, that's the scene. Now, my dissociative episode started when the client walked into the room with the shotgun. All of a sudden, he walked in the room, I looked over and I saw him, and all of a sudden, I had an incredibly strong sense of unreality. That this, and I used the words, and I wrote in the slide the words, "This isn't happening, this can't be happening." And those words were running through my head, but I have to tell you, it's not just a thought. The core of dissociation of consciousness is the experience of it. And that is what happened to me. Things did not seem real. It seemed like a dream. It seemed artificial. I mean, there's hardly any words to it because this is such an unusual experience. The room seemed like, I don't know, like almost like it could be a movie studio scene. So I had both actually depersonalization and derealization. I felt like I was not real and not in touch with reality, and my surroundings seemed unreal. So the first thing was a very strong sense of unreality, and just the words don't capture. It's the experience, the conscious experience of unreality. Secondly, time slowed down, and it slowed down dramatically. It's like a movie, and before this happened to me, this is very early in my career, and I did not know much about dissociation. I'm not even sure I really believed in dissociation because I had really no education about it and no experience with it. Of course you hear stories, but it was dramatic. Time slowed down like in a movie, and you see movies when something violent happens or something unexpected happens, and the filmmaker goes into dramatic kind of slow-mo. And it seems kind of hokey to me. It always seemed kind of hokey to me, and it was not. It was dramatic slow motion. Everybody was kind of frozen in place, except for the deputy who had jumped up and and drawn his gun, as I said. I'm gonna check my time here. Okay. So time slowed down dramatically. So the third aspect of it was I felt like I couldn't think. And it wasn't even like, what should I do? It was just, I couldn't think. Maybe that's just part of the unreality of the situation, but I couldn't make any plans. I couldn't decide what to do. I couldn't think about what's happening. I couldn't decide about what's to do next. None of it just made any sense. So I said everybody was frozen in place, and that really was true. It was, like a frozen tableau. Except that then my body walked itself from where I was seated across the room to the doorway to the kitchen, and then I went across to the doorway and then turned around and looked back. Only, as I said it a second ago, my body did it. I did not do it. I did not have any sense that I was in control of my body, and that's one of these dissociative qualities that we talked about before, a disconnection from my motor control and my sensory awareness of my body. My body by itself walked over there. I felt like I was in Star Wars. They had those giant walking machines with a couple of soldiers sitting up in the bay in the top, looking out through a narrow window. I felt like I was like a little being inside my head looking out through my eyes, and that I did not have any control over my body. And then my body walked back over. Oh, and by the way, I think my body walked itself over to the kitchen doorway to take cover, I guess. I mean, that's the only, that would be what any outside observer would conclude, right? And at that point, I was pretty much an outside observer of my own behavior. And then my body walked back over toward Jamie, who was, a coworker but a friend, and was also pregnant. And so I guess my body was thinking I would try to protect her, but I'm not sure how I could have done that, in the face of a shotgun. But in any case, that happened. So all of these things are going on. And meanwhile, the standoff between the deputy and the client continued, and it seemed like it went on for minutes at a time, back and forth, him yelling, "Drop it, drop it, drop it." But I have to say, I have no sense. I have to say that it probably was just 10 seconds or something like that. But with my impaired sense of time, I couldn't tell at all. So finally, at one point, the client then dropped the gun, and it went clunk when it hit the floor. And as soon as his gun hit the floor, boom, I was back in regular reality, my normal time. I felt like I was back in my body. I felt like everything became normal again. And as I said, this has never happened to me before or since in my life. So we hospitalized him again, obviously. And this obviously became, let me back off on that one. This obviously became a major issue for our program, and revealed that we had done really insufficient screening of when we were called to houses in the community. And I remember this is 30 years ago, and this is in Ann Arbor. I don't think that gun ownership was super high frequency, but you never know. And I certainly had other outreaches with the police when they checked for guns, so it wasn't like there weren't guns around. So we talked about this in the program a lot and changed our screening procedures. But the other piece that's really interesting was, we talked about the case a lot among people in our program. I talked to my friends, I talked to my wife. It was obviously, this was a big deal. It could have ended really badly, and I would have felt responsible too. So, but the other thing I want to mention about dissociation is a French term that was been used in conjunction with dissociation for a long time, and my French is terrible, la belle indifférence, but the basic translation is lack of concern. So what that means is that people who have dissociation characteristically seem to be unconcerned about the implications of the dissociation. For example, when a person with dissociative identity disorder is interviewed, and it's pointed out that, well, wait a minute, you can't remember what happened to you for 3 hours last night, they are like, well, that's no big deal. People don't remember everything. Everybody forgets stuff. Or in those cases of dissociative fugue, same thing. A person can't account for any part of his life until 2 weeks ago when he turned up in Seattle, Washington, and but the person's reaction is, yeah, so no big deal. What's the problem? And so this is kind of what happened to me. In other words, I dissociated my dissociation. What I'm saying is that although the people that I work with, my friends, my wife, we talked about the case and what happened and the implications for our program, but it wasn't for about 2 weeks that I told anybody about my dissociative episode, which was dramatic, right? A huge part of it for me. And the only way I can explain it is what I put in the slide here. It didn't occur to me. My experience was not that I was hiding anything, or that I was, embarrassed or ashamed, or that I didn't want to talk about it for some reason. It was just, it didn't occur to me, like it wasn't important. And finally I did. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe my dissociation about my dissociation wore off, but it took about 2 weeks before it occurred to me to talk about it. And I would just suggest that that's really dramatic and weird and part of the whole dissociative experience as well. All right, so that's my story, and obviously I've remembered it for a long, long time, for my whole life since then. Okay, so that's my story, and I'll see you again next time.